Thank you so much for having us. So I will begin just to give you an overview of the next hour and what we hope to accomplish today. It's a pleasure to speak with you all and provide an introduction to the field of genetic counseling at Broad and beyond. And in the next hour, Sam and I will give a history of genetic counseling and describe the foundations upon which genetic counseling training and the genetic counseling profession are built, along with a description of the current workforce and emerging trends that we're seeing in the field. We're aiming to provide insight into the skill set of the genetic counselors you may work with, collaborate with, or have even met with in regards to your own personal or family history. We hope this information is useful to those who may be considering adding a genetic counselor to their laboratory, clinic, or research team, and for those thinking of pursuing a career in the genetic counseling field. To start, I'd like to introduce two very similar concepts, but to keep in mind the distinction during the talk. So the concept of genetic counseling, a communication process that seeks to translate personal genetic risk information to individuals and families, and differentiate that from genetic counselors, the individuals who have grown a profession out of that genetic counseling need. And the focus of the talk today will really be on the genetic counselor specifically. Now, I've put together a history lesson on genetic counseling, and I hope you won't mind carrying through the decades with me to take us to where we are today. Over the last several decades, the genetic counseling field has evolved rapidly along with the field of clinical genetics and the availability and expansion of genetic and genomic testing. So I'll review key milestones in the growth of the field, mainly focused on the US. There is a global genetic counseling movement as well that Sam will talk about later in the talk. So the term genetic counseling was first described back in 1947 as the interaction of explaining the likelihood of passing a certain trait to offspring. And at the time, this was most often occurring in hereditary disease clinics before there was really any testing that could be offered to families. It wasn't until 1969 that we see the first graduate degree program established at Sarah Lawrence College, formalizing the training of genetic counselors. And that was the first program established worldwide for the practice of genetic counseling. And over the next few years, more training programs would be established across the country. Another big milestone was that the National Society of Genetic Counselors, our professional society, was incorporated in 1979, founded by over 200 genetic counselors at the time, funded that initiative themselves. And since its inception, NSGC has advanced the roles of genetic counselors in healthcare by fostering education, research, and the public policy needed to ensure the availability of quality genetic services to those that need it. In 1982, another big step was that the American Board of Medical Genetics began certifying genetic counselors. And at the time, that was through the same general exam that was taken by medical and laboratory geneticists, with a subspecialty exam specifically for genetic counseling. And in 1992, the Journal of Genetic Counseling was established, which provided a first and still a dedicated venue for research focused on genetic counseling. In 1993, the American Board of Genetic Counseling is created and assumes the responsibility of certifying genetic counselors and accrediting the training program. So you can see over the years how we've really cemented the field and given a foundation to launch new genetic counselors. By the mid-90s, genetic counselors were not only providing services in pediatric and prenatal clinics, especially as that testing became available, but expanding into cancer genetics as more genes linked to cancer susceptibility were discovered and single gene testing becomes more widely available. As of 1997, with the addition of a genetic counselor in North Dakota, genetic counselors were working in all 50 states. So the first genetic counseling licensure law, I'll talk a bit about licensure later in the talk, was introduced in California in the year 2000. And the first genetic counseling license was issued 2 years later in Utah. And since that time, that's been a big push in the field. Genetic counselors have been pursuing licensure laws across the country. In the mid-2000s, you're all very familiar with what happened then. The Human Genome Project was completed, providing knowledge and insight that would push clinical genetics forward. And we see with that a big expansion in the field to go along with that. At the time, there were over 15 genetic counselors practicing. And at that point, MSGC took the opportunity to redefine the term genetic counseling and what it was that genetic counselors provided to the process of helping people understand and adapt to the medical, psychological, and familial implications of genetic contributions to disease. Over that next decade, the Professional Status Survey, which is issued to all genetic counselors by the National Society, showed a 75% increase in the number of genetic counselors working. We see growth in subspecialties, especially those beyond the clinic, such as in laboratories. And by 2019, there were over 5,000 genetic counselors in the United States, 50 accredited training programs, and we now see that there are approximately 400 new graduates entering the workforce annually from these training programs. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the first graduating class of genetic counselors, so great time to be giving this talk. So thank you for joining me on that brief tour through genetic counseling history. I certainly learned some things putting it together, so I hope you did too. And now that we've covered where genetic counselors have been, we can focus on where we are now, what the workforce looks like today. In most cases, an applicant for genetic counseling training has completed undergraduate work in biology or social sciences. A master's degree in genetic counseling is then obtained from one of those accredited programs. There are currently 51 programs in the US, and that number continues to grow. Each accredited curriculum is based on a minimum set of practice-based competencies that we'll touch on and are met through a combination of coursework, independent research, and clinical training under the supervision of a certified genetic counselor. Upon graduation, the individual must pass a board exam to be certified, and in many states, genetic counselors must also obtain a license to practice. Job opportunities for genetic counselors, again, continue to grow, especially as our field advances, the field of clinical genetics, not only genetic counseling. And for those genetic counselors working in a hospital or clinic, the number of specialties in which they practice has expanded. Genetic counselors now work in laboratories, research, academia, industry, for professional and patient organizations, and healthcare administration, public health, and in policy, just to name a few. And it's clear that training focused in both clinical genetics knowledge and communication has been proven broadly applicable. What you can't see here is that genetic counselors don't work in isolation, but are most often working as members of an interdisciplinary clinical laboratory or research team. As I mentioned, there are now over 5,000 genetic counselors certified by the American Board of Genetic Counseling. And based on responses from a professional status survey conducted last year, we can see that half of the workforce, or about half, 49% of genetic counselors, are actually working in just 10 US states. So those are listed here in descending order. You see Massachusetts is among them. And you can see how access to a genetic counselor services can be an issue, not only because of the limited number of genetic counselors there are to go around across the country, but also because the job opportunities are clustered in major metropolitan areas. So the number of states having passed genetic counseling licensure laws continues to grow, and we hope that this helps contribute to opportunities to genetic counseling across the United States. So genetic counselors continue to advocate for licensing in states where it is not available yet. And to touch on what is the goal of licensure, why do we spend so much time talking about it? So the goal of licensure is to ensure that licensees have the minimal degree of competency necessary to ensure that public health, safety, and welfare are protected. Additionally, licensure has important implications for reimbursement, as insurance companies do not reimburse for services from unlicensed professionals. So in states without licensing, hospitals cannot bill and receive reimbursement for genetic counselors' services. Even with licensure, there are still barriers to reimbursement, and therefore access to genetic counselors is an issue. And licensure is an important step along the way to overcoming some of these barriers. So I will point out the hard work of genetic counselors in Massachusetts. Our licensing law was passed in 2006. And again, that was championed by those working here in the state. And thinking about the access issue, another step that genetic counselors have taken to access who can get to their services is a law in the House of Representatives right now called the Access to Genetic Counselor Services Act. Research demonstrates that certified genetic counselors improve the quality of patients' healthcare and reduce the cost of genetic services. So this step was taken to remove barriers to accessing services provided by genetic counselors. It was introduced in 2019. It is still pending, but I'll tell you a bit about it because you may be hearing more about it. The legislation modernizes Medicare by providing Medicare status to genetic counselors and allowing their services to be delivered to Medicare beneficiaries as they are for those with commercial health insurance. And again, the bill will also reimburse genetic counselors, making it easier for employers such as hospitals to hire them. So all the issues related to reimbursement are truly around allowing hospitals to hire more genetic counselors, just not genetic counselors being compensated for their services. So the last element I'll touch on now that you know where the workforce stands, the advocacy that's going on, I'll focus on the competency. So what are we trained in? What are we expected to do when we take on our first genetic counseling role or our 10th genetic counseling role? First published in 1996, the Accreditation Council for Genetic Counseling maintains a list of competencies, which are updated over time to ensure they remain current and reflect the state of genetic counseling. So these are informed by surveys that go out to the field of genetic counselors to determine their day-to-day activities, what they're working on, what they feel they need to be competent in. And the purpose of putting together this list is to describe what an entry-level provider must demonstrate to successfully practice as a genetic counselor and provide guidance for the training of genetic counselors and an assessment for maintenance of competency of practicing GCs. Currently, the document describes 22 practice-based competencies broken into 4 domains. I assure you I will not read them to you individually, but I would like to highlight those domains and some of the examples of competencies that go along with them. And I would like to walk you through, just because I know some people may be attending the talk because they're unfamiliar with the field of genetic counseling, or maybe you've only had a brief encounter with a genetic counselor and it's kind of informed your worldview of our practice. So I'd like to take a step back just so you're familiar with all of the skills that a genetic counselor is expected to have when they're released from their training program. So you can think about any needs you may have in your clinic, laboratory, or research group to see if any of these would be of use, and perhaps a genetic counselor is a role you can consider adding if you haven't already. So the first is quite obvious, putting the genetic in genetic counseling is genetics expertise, which involves developing an understanding of genetics and genetic conditions, taking a thorough family history and a pedigree, and using this knowledge to assess risk for a given condition and identify and facilitate appropriate testing. So often this is taking place in a clinic, but more and more the genetic counselor may be performing these on the laboratory end of the kind of testing spectrum. And of course, this information changes over time. So what a genetic counselor was learning as genetics and genomics in the 1990s has changed very rapidly in our current day. So this is not only taught at the time of genetic counseling training, but continues in continuing education for those who need to recertify to keep up that knowledge. The second domain is interpersonal, psychosocial, and counseling skills. And this domain includes contracting with a patient to ensure their needs are met, promoting both informed and client-centered decision-making, and maintaining the flexibility to do so across delivery models, such as the huge shift to telegenetics this past year, and to make sure these responses are culturally responsive based on the client sitting in front of you. And client is used here rather than patient because as more and more genetic counselors are out there practicing, we know that the person that they're often working with is not always a patient seeking healthcare. It may be another healthcare provider, it may be a research subject, it may be the public. So again, think about these skills as anyone the genetic counselor is providing information to, not just a patient in a clinical scenario. The third domain is education, focusing on the skills to educate clients specifically about genetics and genomics, and to do it effectively for audiences of varying backgrounds, particularly those who aren't thinking about genetics on a day-to-day basis, but may need to use that information to make big decisions in their lives, and different ways to communicate this information based on your audience, written or verbal. And finally, professional development and practice. And I think some of the things that I've already touched on, licensure and other access to genetic counseling service barriers that we're trying to overcome, has really been pushed by the profession itself. So that's really become part of the work that we do to assess what's needed in the field and then try to grow from there. So the professional development practice includes upholding the principles and values of genetic counseling through research, advocacy, and supervision of trainees, so training the next generation, as well as establishing professional interdisciplinary relationships throughout hospitals, research centers, wherever you may work, to make sure you're taking in the expertise of others, and hopefully they would be taking up the expertise of you within the clinical genetics domain. So that was a rapid introduction to all that genetic counseling has to offer. But I will take this opportunity to pass it over to Sam to expand on the genetic counseling skills and where they're taking us.
Great. Thank you, Danielle. So as Danielle mentioned, I will be taking you sort of beyond the training and beyond the clinic, actually. So Danielle gave you a great history lesson and overview of our training and what the traditional clinics look like. But really what I'm going to be focusing on here is how we can apply our training beyond the clinic. And the reason the clinic is in quotes is because over the last 20 years, we've seen so many changes over so many years of what is truly the clinic. It started often as prenatal, then cancer and pediatrics, but really what we're seeing is now genomics is really being integrated into all aspects of medicine and in pharmacology. And so the clinic is really following along with that. There's some, more and more emerging roles for genetic counselors that I want to cover. So traditionally, the most common location for genetic counselors was in academic medical centers and in hospitals. So this data is as of 2020, and really this is even a huge change from what we would have seen 10, 15 years ago. So previously hospitals would have been, 80 to 90% of all genetic counselors would have been sitting in that space. But currently about 62% of genetic counselors sit in hospitals. This primarily is academic medical centers, but it's also public and private hospitals. About 20% of genetic counselors are employed through a laboratory. So this is most often commercial laboratories, but can also be academic laboratories as well, based in hospitals or other academic institutions. But what we're also seeing are these other areas that each of these make up about 1 to 5% of employment of genetic counselors. And this includes universities. So as Danielle mentioned, there's more and more training programs, and those training programs employ genetic counselors. And then also telehealth companies. This is one of the most rapidly growing areas for genetic counselors. So certainly these were actually coming before the pandemic and COVID, but the last year has really exploded these services and had a lot more adoption of this model than in previous times. These are both telehealth companies that are spun out of hospitals or academic institutions, but also startups created by genetic counselors themselves, pharmaceutical companies, test utilization management services, nonprofit organizations and government, as well as insurance companies and benefit management companies. And even within the last year or so, we've seen even newer models, including private practice, not-for-profit that are specifically not associated with the government, but might be even smaller startup style not-for-profits, health advocacy groups, biotech and research development, genomic software companies, consulting companies. These are all newer places that, less than 10 genetic counselors currently sit there. But this sort of middle ring here was once less than 10 genetic counselors, and even laboratories was once then less than 10 genetic counselors who work there. So these are really areas that we're starting to see genetic counselors infiltrate. And really, it's a lot of our training that Danielle has just shown you really applies to all areas of the genetics and genomics environment. And so I will take the next couple slides to show you why exactly our training applies so well to all of these different settings. So Danielle went into our competence-based practices, but I wanted to break it down into sort of 4 primary elements. So care coordination, education, counseling, and interpretation are really the core foundations of what we learned during our training. But these really apply to both some hard skills and some soft skills that we can put into any area. So for care coordination, this is the hard skill is the knowledge of the healthcare industry, billing, and insurance. And the soft skill is working independently as part of a team. I think it's very obvious to everybody probably is listening to this talk is why both of those skills are things that any setting would be very interested in if they have a space in the genomics business. Then education, this is just explaining complex information in a simple language and a commitment to educating others. So explaining complex information in simple language, as Danielle mentioned, we've sort of shifted from saying patient to client, but I would even expand upon that to say that this can be utilized in explaining complex information to a computer or to a software developer who's trying to make an algorithm or a script that can be implemented. Really what we've learned is a way of understanding what is the needs of the person sitting in front of us or the tool sitting in front of us and how to adapt the information we're trying to communicate or explain to the needs of that individual or tool, which brings me to the next point of counseling. As a genetic counselor who has been sitting in sort of a non-patient facing or a non-traditional space since the beginning, I've always, been told or had people say, don't you miss the counseling aspect? Or, it's funny you're called a genetic counselor when you don't do any counseling right now. But I actually push back and say, I use my counseling skills every hour of the day and every meeting I attend, because counseling is really communication, both written and verbal. And most importantly, listening to what's being said, what's not being said, what's being conveyed through body language or nonverbal cues, understanding, going back to that education piece, what people are looking for and in what manner they need that information conveyed to them. And finally, interpretation. This is really just expertise in genetics and a commitment to lifelong learning and figuring out the new information that is evolving in our field and understanding how to integrate that into your practice, whether that's practice in the clinic or practice at a pharmaceutical company or practice in your research. And so this is not just a trend that we are sort of sitting back and saying that we see. This is being tracked regularly through the National Society of Genetic Counselors. And in fact, the numbers are really showing strongly that this shift that we had all kind of felt coming is really here and is starting to take hold. So you can see down in 2012, 84% of genetic counselors sat in a direct-to-patient care setting. When I started about 15 years ago, that was probably closer to 90%. And only 16% sat in a non-direct patient care. And the idea of having a dual role where both you interacted with patients, but then had a side position that perhaps was not involved in non-direct patient care was not even something that was being tracked, because it was such the rare opportunity that you got to do both. But I will say even back then and even earlier into the 2000s was something that so many genetic counselors talked about wanting the opportunity to do and have that balance of both types of roles. And sure enough, in 2020, I think that desire has really started to come through and realize that a lot of genetic counselors have embraced that and that there's a need for it. And now only about half of genetic counselors have a solely direct to patient care position. And the remaining half is split between non-direct care and mixed positions. And I would even say the lines between this are becoming more and more blurred. Having taken the professional status survey myself quite a bit over the last couple decades, I've always declared myself as a non-direct patient care genetic counselor. However, lately in my research, I work with patient-led organizations and family-led organizations who are trying to cure their own diseases and work with researchers to figure out, what the next steps are. And I help provide a service and research that can allow them to try to estimate their disease prevalence and understand how many families are out there that are like them. And so I work with patients on a daily or weekly basis, but it's not in a care setting. I'm not, talking to them about their care, but is that a non-direct position or is that a mixed position? It's really this evolving sort of style of genetic counseling where we're not just there to disclose results, we're really there to help families through where genomics is taking them. And so I really think that over the next 10 years, we're really going to have to step back and think about this, what is patient care, what's not patient care, and what is the role of genetic counselors in this space, and how do we see ourselves as working with these families and patients on the longer journey of, having a genetic disease or a genetic predisposition. So I did want to give you a couple ideas of what these sort of non-clinic roles look like. The first one are NIH grant research roles. These are all terms that I think everybody at the Broad are very familiar with, so I won't spend too much time defining these roles, but genetic counselors are principal investigators for NIH grant research roles. This is something very new. Previously, this was not something attainable by genetic counselors, but over the last couple of years, we've actually seen successful applications with genetic counselors being the principal investigators. Quite a lot of genetic counselors are project managers on NIH grants, coordinators as well. And many of us actually sit on external scientific panels and give guidance on the way that these programs should be run. Within the laboratory roles, because this is sort of the longest running non-traditional position for genetic counselors, there's quite a lot of roles, and not every laboratory genetic counselor does all of these. There's many different types of laboratory genetic counselors, just as there's many specialties for clinical counselors, but this is sort of a taste of all the different opportunities for genetic counselors within the laboratory role. So many genetic counselors will review genetic test orders as they come in and do a independent assessment of whether the best test was ordered. Now, this is not always looked at from a clinical set. It could be, you ordered this test, but we actually think based off of the medical information given, there might be a less expensive test that's more targeted, and you could start there. Sometimes it is saying there's a larger test that might be a better fit. And usually this is a conversation with the ordering provider to see if they want to change it. They get to make the final decision, but the genetic counselors are there as a sort of a second check and to be able to provide the physicians who ordered the test with some guidance. Many of the physicians who order testing have little to no training on genetics. There are cardiologists who had one course on genetics and now are being expected to order exome or a panel. And so the genetic counselors can really partner with them to help them in choosing the best test for their patient if they don't have a genetic counselor actually in their clinic. We perform variant interpretation quite regularly, writing the actual reports that go out, communicating the results back to the physician to help give them tips and tricks for complex results and help them with sort of the nuance of the returning those results if they need it. In some cases, we actually can return the results directly to the patient from the laboratory as well. And so some of the more direct to consumer genetic testing companies, product development, medical science liaisons, marketing and education material creation, and then certainly research and publications. Even commercial laboratories are a huge source of knowledge within our field. And so they rely on the genetic counselors to help write abstracts and present at conferences, write publications to get that information back to the community. Pharmaceutical companies have become a big player in the field, especially over the last 5 to 10 years. And many times they employ genetic counselors through acquisition of genetic testing labs, but we're also starting to see more organic roles starting within these pharmaceutical companies, especially pharmaceutical companies who are interested in very rare disease. And so we're seeing this role of patient engagement advocate starting to emerge across a lot of pharmaceutical companies in the rare disease disease space specifically, where they build partnerships with the advocacy groups and the medical communities to provide more education and awareness around the clinical trials and the diseases themselves. And they can also be patient advocates and help with connecting to healthcare providers as well. So there's only a few genetic counselors who fit in this space, but I can already see it ripe for a lot of genetic counselors starting to help with this. Just again, going back to our training, I think you could see why this is a very natural fit for a role for a genetic counselor. Test utilization management. This is an area that has really expanded over the last 5 years. And I'll be very honest, it's one that I still have to wrap my head around all the time of what the business model is and how the genetic counselors work. But the more I learn about it, the more it's such an aha moment looking back. Obviously, a genetic counselor should have been involved in this, but it wasn't readily apparent to me looking at it 5 years ago. But this can happen in a lot of different settings. So insurance companies, benefit management companies, and even hospitals themselves want to take a look at the tests that are being ordered and see if money is being used in the most appropriate way and if the right tests are being ordered. But recently, in the last few years, you even see these companies that actually are third-party test utilization management companies as well that will come in and do these examinations for you. So you can examine the test orders on sort of a global level to try to identify possible sources of wasted spending. They can sometimes drill in and just look at the appropriateness for a specific patient, reviewing medical records to come up with best approaches for a given patient, recommend cost-efficient and clinically correct testing, and then also working with healthcare providers or hospitals to facilitate the proper test ordering process as well. So now that I've covered sort of the expanding areas of our roles, I wanted to highlight a few emerging topics within the genetic counseling community. So these are sort of our hot topics that are coming up within our community beyond sort of the newest and latest and greatest information in genetics itself. So Danielle already talked about licensure and the bill that we have going on. So I'm not going to spend any time on that. But what I am going to talk about are some of the things that are a little, I don't even want to say debated. We know these things are coming and need to be addressed, but exactly the best approach for these things are probably what is the thing we're kind of diving in and trying to wrap our heads around. So the first one, the entirety of this game is actually a quote from Mary Freivogel, who is the past president of the National Society of Genetic Counselors. So I'm going to play this game with all of you if you are willing to go on this journey with me. So let's play a game. I'm going to read a list of statements, and I want all of you to guess what I'm describing. Are you ready? Here we go. So collects detailed personal and family health or family history information, develops a differential diagnosis, provides informed consent, discloses genetic test results, provides a standard plan for medical management. Does everyone have a guess? I would hope, given the talk that or the topics that Danielle covered and what I've gone through, you're probably thinking about a genetic counselor. But if you are, you're incorrect. All of the statements I just read are describing a chatbot. So this is something that has come up in the last few years and is absolutely a hot topic within our community, and that is AI. This is not isolated to genetic counselors or to the genetics field. It's really something, across the medical field that clinicians are having a hard time wrapping their heads around and figuring out whether to or how to embrace these technologies. So the pros to integrating AI into genetic counseling is it allows us to return to the heart of genetic counseling. So when you think about AI and all of the sort of knowledge and education that it could help us provide our patients and having this natural language processing and being able to handle communication with patients, what AI doesn't have is the ability to show empathy, the ability to look at nonverbal cues and to really know the right question to ask based off of what's not being said. And that is really what genetic counselors bring to the genomics community, is really understanding the art of communication. So that would, having the ability to kind of step back from making sure that we go through the checklist of information that we need to kind of dump on a patient sometimes, that we feel like we're just trying to convey everything because we have to know that they knew every fact. Having these chatbots help with that and being able to really dive in and have the patient or the client understand, what are they missing? What do they need to process internally in order to really accept a diagnosis or accept a plan of care that comes out of a diagnosis? Have them understand what they might not yet know or might not yet want to know, and form a relationship with them so that as they go through the process of ingesting a risk or ingesting a diagnosis, they can know what questions they want to ask now and questions that they want to ask later. The sort of opportunity from AI that I like to look at is that, a human still has to work with these tools to be able to train them on what is the information that it needs to be conveyed. And so I think that this is really ripe for genetic counselors to partner with these tools. There was a fabulous interview by Melinda Gates, where she was really pushing and explaining the importance of having diverse representation in the building of these types of AI tools. And she mentioned how the reason that we need to embrace women and individuals of diverse culture in the development of these tools is that these tools take on the inherent biases of the people who build them. It's something that we just can't separate. And so I really heard that, and it struck a chord with me of why genetic counselors need to be involved in the building of these tools and not let other people take the forefront on this and just accept it as this is going to happen and we just have to wait for it. We really need to be on the front lines pushing for how this is done. And genetic counselors need to have an understanding of clinical informatics and how these tools are being built so that we can make sure that the heart of genetic counseling is built into that, and that we are aware of these ideas and how the nuances of this information needs to be conveyed, and bake that into the chatbots and bake that into these deep learning and natural language processing algorithms and infrastructure are being built. So the next topic Danielle mentioned already is globalization for genetic counselors. So, for a long time, the vast majority, if not all of genetic counselors were found in North America, specifically the US and Canada. But now we have started to go global. So as of 2018, there are about 7,000 genetic counselors in 84 training programs across 28 countries. But even today, the vast majority of genetic counselors and training programs are based in the US. So even with this growth, the majority of the world's population does not have access to a genetic counselor in their own country, and most potential students would need to be trained abroad. So genetic counseling education is already known to be expensive. Quite often the training programs are at private academic institutions, and that is certainly a barrier to education. Putting on top of that, needing to leave your country of origin and travel to another country, assess with address visa issues, language barriers for training. A lot of the training programs are in English-based countries, and being able to have this spread to the countries that are not highlighted in the bright blue here is something we need to address, because as Danielle mentioned, one of the biggest parts of communication in genetic counseling is understanding the cultural kind of environment around a patient, and the way that somebody may ingest risk or a diagnosis is really based in sort of their upbringing and their cultural understanding. And so there's such a need to make sure that genetic counselors are based in every country so that they have that awareness and they are from those cultures and can really meet the patients where they are. And so this is something that the field has to address. There are new international organizations that are coming together to have genetic counselors from around the world address training and education and think about how do we think about genetic counseling as it adapts to different cultures. A lot of the training was developed in the US and has very much the US mindset, but that doesn't apply across everybody. And so we need to really think about that as we expand. And that brings us to the last hot topic, but certainly not the least. I think this is actually the most important, is diversity in the field, or lack thereof. And my bright red, this must change. I was originally going to have this be something that I kind of had as animation show up at the end, but I thought it was so important, I wanted it there from the beginning. So in the US, genetic counselors' demographics are largely homogeneous. And remember that we are the vast majority of genetic counselors out there. So this makes this issue even more necessary to change. So 95% of genetic counselors are female, 93% are heterosexual, 99.9% are cisgender, 90% are white, only 2% identify themselves as part of the disability community, 14% are fluent in a second language, and as Danielle mentioned, 66% work in a major metropolitan area. The vast majority of the world's population does not see themselves in the US genetic counselor, and this absolutely must change. From a field, we need to approach this, and we need to be very serious about this, and I think our field is serious about changing this. But to anybody who does not see themselves in this description and is interested in a genetic counseling role, please, I beg you to, I know you don't see yourself in the current field, but see yourself in the patients who need you. The vast majority of patients and clients do not see themselves in this either, and they deserve to see themselves in the genetic counselor that they talk to. And so we need to kind of come at this from both ends, of both changing as a field so others can see themselves in it, but also really expand outreach and education so that more and more people are aware of genetic counseling as a profession, and become interested at a young age so that we can help them get there and address a lot of the barriers that keep individuals who don't fit this description from joining our field. And so again, I leave with saying that this is probably our most important issue, because this is a huge barrier to expanding genetic counseling across the world, and having patients feel like they are seen and heard, and that their sort of view on how to integrate genetic information is understood by the people who are providing them that care. So now my final slides are talking about specifically the roles of genetic counselors at the Broad. So at the Broad, genetic counselors have a slightly different title. We are clinical genomics specialists. This is an official matrix. We have two roles that are sort of the genetic counselor assistant type roles. So these are people who could help with integrating clinical information, help with coordination of anything in sort of the genetic counseling space. And then we have three roles for genetic counselors at various levels. The genetic counselors are the clinical genomics specialists who currently work at the Broad, range across a variety of different tasks: research and protocol development, project operations, data modeling and sharing, variant curation, patient engagement and education, and then research and publications as well. There are multiple projects with genetic counselors already part of the team, including the Rare Genomes Project, the Center for Mendelian Genomics, NOMAD, the Clinical Genome Resource called ClinGen, NeuroDev, and the Cardiovascular Disease Initiative. So we currently have 4 genetic counselors who are primarily employed by the Broad, but we have quite a few genetic counselors who are affiliates of the Broad and work at the local hospitals, but support ongoing Broad research. And so we wanted a way to connect all of us together. We work with the other genetic counselors just because of the roles and our tight-knit community, but I wanted an opportunity for these genetic counselors to come together and have the space to either learn from Broad PIs or Broad researchers on topics that either are coming to the clinic or in the clinic already, but also find a way to have us talk about our own emerging topics and address some of these issues that I just mentioned, but specific to the Broad community. So the goal of this group is to expand the knowledge of Broad genetic counselors, educate the Broad community on the role of genetic counselors like we're doing today, and increase the accessibility of GCs as a resource to the Broad employees. And so, like I said, this is for genetic counselors who either work directly at the Broad or for affiliate members or genetic counselors who support ongoing Broad research. So we have put together a couple different resources for the larger Broad community and beyond. So as Danielle mentioned, we were hoping that this talk would kind of meet different needs for different groups. And so we also put together different resources for different groups. So the one on your left is for individuals who may be wondering if a genetic counselor should be part of your team. That QR code will take you to a pamphlet highlighting a lot of the things we talked about today, but things to consider if you are interested in adding a genetic counselor to your team. The one on the right is for individuals who may be interested in becoming a genetic counselor and has tips and tricks of how to learn more about the profession or where to find out about more programs. And so I'll just pause here for a minute so that people can take pictures if they want. But certainly, if you have any questions, the Genetic Counseling Affinity Group and Danielle and myself are more than happy to answer questions. And I have an email for us at the end that you can reach out to. But please reach out. We love talking about this topic. We love, talking with people who are just interested because they're interested, or people who really need help in certain action points. Any and all questions are really encouraged. And with that, I will say thank you. So Danielle and I are representing a larger group of genetic counselors. GC at Broad is our affinity group, and our email is geneticcounselors@broadinstitute.org. And we hope to hear from many of you. So with that, I will pause and see if we have any questions.
Thank you so much, Samantha and Danielle. That was such a wonderful talk and such a great just summary of both your field and then also the genetic counseling here at Broad. I believe actually Diane had a question for you.
Yes, thank you so much, Samantha and Danielle. As Sarah mentioned, that was a really wonderful talk and certainly alerted me to many ideas and considerations that I was not aware of at all. So thank you very much for that. On that point of awareness and to your point about trying to let students who may be interested in this field know very early, I'll just mention I used to teach at an undergraduate institution in a rural area far away from a metropolitan center. And I got the sense that my students were not aware, and at the time I personally didn't have the awareness to let them know of this career path, which in retrospect I suspect would have been of interest to many of them. I wonder, I'm guessing there are probably paths that genetic counseling as a profession is taking to help students learn, or instructors in those areas learn about how they can help students to become aware of this path and what courses and other preparations they may want to make early to get ready for it. And so I'm curious about how that works.
Yeah, so it's definitely a multi-pronged approach. So, from the sort of the spot of NSGC as an organization, we have put forth sort of board-based initiatives of trying to kind of have better social media presence, putting out PR information about genetic counseling as a profession, and the growth in salary and the growth in size, and trying to show people that this is something that is worth the investment of the cost of education. For a long time, being very honest, genetic counselors were paid less than what they paid in order to actually get the degree. And so you sort of did the math. You're like, I could work for 10 years with no taxes and anything and still not pay back my student loans. Why am I supposed to do this? That really has changed quite a bit. And so trying to get that message out there to show people this is attainable and financially something that you can take on. Also trying to get out the message of how much genetic counselors are satisfied with their position and how much opportunity sits in front of us in job security. But then at a personal level, I went to a very rural school, not near a metropolitan area, and actually learned about about genetic counseling from my genetics professor, who was a PhD researcher, but happened to have his clinical geneticist friend who he had done training with come and talk about clinical genetics as the field, and talked about genetic counselors. And that's how I found out about it. And so a lot of genetic counselors are trying to pay it back by looking back to their college professors and saying, I'd love to come give a career talk so that people can be aware of this, or go into high schools and talk about this. So there's both a global kind of how do we get the message out and in media, but then also taking personal action to kind of say, let me reach back to that rural school, or if you came from a rural setting yourself, getting the word back to people. And then a lot of programs have also taken up social media and trying to get the information out there and kind of meet the students where they are at and trying to bring them in.